The next day, after learning I had fled the wedding, he smiled and handled the situation with both families. He looked at me as though I were a child throwing a tantrum until I took his hand and placed it into the hand of his female assistant. The man who had always been distant with me finally appeared flustered. The banquet hall buzzed with excitement as wine glasses were passed around. I strolled in wearing sunglasses and carrying a custom-made designer bag. 2 hours earlier, I had received a message from Ivy Anastasia. Jonah is celebrating my birthday at Jinfo today. Feel free to come join us. I could almost picture the smug expression on her face as she sent the message. If this had been 6 months ago, I might have slapped Ivy to show her what it was like to be dominated by the legitimate wife. But I wouldn't do that now. I even visited a beauty salon, feeling at ease. Men might betray me, but money and beauty bought with it would not. As I entered the banquet hall looking radiant, Jonah had already been invited onto the stage by Ivy. The crowd cheered as they jointly cut the cake, and afterward, they embraced each other tightly like a loving couple. Amidst the lively atmosphere, someone shouted for them to kiss. Ivy shyly glanced at Jonah, as if contemplating what to say but holding back. Jonah, fulfilling everyone's expectations, gently kissed her forehead, treating her like a cherished treasure. After the applause died down, I observed Ivy's eyes, glistening with tears as I gracefully walked toward them. When Jonah saw me, he looked momentarily flustered before frowning. "Anastasia, what are you doing here?" But I ignored him, focusing only on Ivy. Then I suddenly smiled lightly yet with complete seriousness. I took Jonah's hand and placed it into Ivy's. "Miss Sue, since you so kindly invited me, I couldn't let you down. I didn't come prepared with a gift, but I'll give you this." I offered Jonah as a gift in front of everyone. Those who knew I was still engaged to him were too shocked to speak. Jonah, looking insulted, quickly pulled his hand out of Ivy's. "Anastasia, there should be limits to your nonsense," he said, visibly angry. I glanced at him nonchalantly, my gaze calm and emotionless. "I'm not being ridiculous. The only gift I have for Miss Sue now is the identity of Mrs. Jonah." Jonah stood there staring at me, his emotions unreadable. At 17, I had made the same wish every year, to reach the legal age for marriage and become Jonah's wife. By 24, I had nearly realized this dream, but the night before the wedding, Jonah shattered it. He sat in his usual chair and said flatly, "I will divorce you in a year." I couldn't believe it and asked why. He responded with a cold expression, offering no emotion. "After being together for 7 years, I no longer love you. All that's left is obligation. The only thing I can offer you is the title of Mrs. Jonah." I was stunned for a moment, then nervously laughed. Jonah and I had been childhood friends, and our families were neighbors. He had been attractive, and I had always followed him around for 17 years. Finally, on his 17th birthday, I turned him from a childhood friend into my boyfriend. Did he love me? I thought so. After all, why would he have gotten so upset in freshman year when someone gave me a love letter? Or why would he have pulled me away from a male colleague in my first job, looking at him with a warning? When I recalled these signs of his love, my vision blurred with tears. Seeing me cry, Jonah reached out, as he always did, to wipe away my tears. I avoided his touch, and he seemed surprised, withdrawing his hand. "Anastasia, forgive me. Just think of me as a bad person at heart. A marriage can't survive without love. But don't worry, I won't back out of tomorrow's wedding," he said, reaching for my hair. I didn't respond. Jonah thought I had accepted his approach and sighed before leaving. Once the door closed, I looked at the delicate hairpins and rings on the dressing table and felt an urge to knock them all down. But instead, I simply removed my bright red pajamas, sent Jonah a text saying I wouldn't attend the wedding and that we should break off the engagement, and left the house without even taking my ID card. That night, I drove to the riverside, staying there in the cold wind until noon. When I returned home, my parents and Jonah's family were sitting in the living room. Mom rushed to me, scanning me from head to toe and scolding, "You naughty girl! Even if you're happy about marrying Jonah, you don't have to do this." Just as I was about to respond, Jonah approached and gently put his arm around my waist. "Auntie, don't blame Anastasia. It's all my fault, Newsome," he said. Mom, who had never liked Jonah, softened. Over time, with my constant praise, she had come to accept him. At his words, she smiled, though there was a clear hint of, "If not for Jonah, I would surely punish you." After the family left, Jonah removed his arm from my waist. Anastasia, what are you doing? I've already said I'll make you Mrs. Jonah. Why are you still... He was puzzled, clearly not understanding why I had run from the wedding. I reached up and gently touched his eyebrows as I once had. Jonah, if we're destined for divorce in a year, there's no point in continuing this engagement, is there? He frowned, asking, why isn't there a need? I replied, the alliance between our families benefits both of our companies. I smiled, but tears began to fall. Then just wait, Jonah. There won't be a day we go to the Civil Affairs Bureau together. Jonah looked confused. Anastasia, what do you mean? The engagement can continue, but from now on, we'll each go our separate ways, I explained. Jonah, both angry and amused, replied, you've been following me for 24 years. Can you really do that? There was a tone of smugness, as if he thought he knew me well, but he didn't understand. Some women become tougher when they choose to give up, even tougher than they were when they were pursuing someone. That day, Jonah and I parted on bad terms. I refrained from contacting him, but the day after, he caused a stir by hiring a personal assistant named Ivy, a young, pretty woman who Jonah doted on. He began taking her to important events and even let her enter our wedding house. When Ivy sent me a message, I was looking through old photos. Anastasia, I'm Ivy, President Jonah's assistant. We're at the villa on Chinu Road. Do you remember where Jonah's blue shirt is? Chinu Road was our wedding house. He had brought another woman there. When I realized this, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I thought it should hurt more. I directly called Jonah. Did you take Ivy to our wedding house? On the other end of the line, he chuckled. I fell silent, feeling a deep, sour pang in my heart. I could feel my emotions rising uncontrollably, and though I wanted to cry, I held back the tears, remembering the person on the other end of the line. Jonah stayed quiet as well, and we sat in silence for a while. After a few minutes, the heaviness in my heart slowly faded. All right, I won't go to that house anymore, I said, hanging up the phone. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, lost in thought. For the first 24 years of my life, I had always been centered around Jonah. His happiness made me happy, and his sadness made me sad. To fully move on from him, I wasn't sure how long it would take, but I knew I had to start taking action. From that day on, I kept myself busy. My parents had always encouraged me to learn how to manage the company, but I had no interest before. Back then, I thought Jonah was enough. Looking back, I realized how blindly in love I had been. So I decided to tell my dad that I wanted to learn from him, and he agreed happily. Somehow, word got around to Jonah that I had started working in the family business. He, who hadn't reached out to me since our last argument, suddenly called me. Anastasia, I've told Ivy not to go to our wedding house anymore. At that moment, I was so caught up in my paperwork that it took me a while to respond. Oh, Jonah, I said, as my mind struggled to focus on what I was reading. After a pause, Jonah continued, if it bothers you, I can arrange for a different place. I frowned, turning another page. Do as you like, I muttered. The words on the page made sense, but I couldn't make sense of them together. I was frustrated. Jonah, too, seemed frustrated with my casual response. Anastasia, I've been as accommodating as I can. What more do you want from me? He added, being so distant isn't good for you, you know. I looked away from my papers, thought for a moment, and then confirmed that I was just too busy to engage with him. I sighed and said, if you think I'm being distant, then think that. The silence around me felt deafening after I sighed, and I was stunned by how much Jonah's influence on me had lessened. He seemed oblivious to the change. It was as if he was seeking revenge. He appeared more publicly with Ivy, attending important events together. Soon, the story of him spending a fortune at an auction just to make Ivy smile spread throughout the circle. Before long, someone sent me a video. In it, a rich, second-generation young man teased Jonah, asking if he was worried about how his fiancée would feel about his extravagant display. Jonah took a sip of wine, remaining silent for a moment before smugly replying, she's very obedient. She won't make a fuss. The room fell silent for a second, and then several people agreed. Of course, who else but President Jonah could have Miss Anastasia follow him around all these years? Seeing Jonah in the video with that confident expression made me mock him. I once gave you that confidence, I thought, but now I'm going to take it back, piece by piece. Originally, the marriage alliance between the Lin and Han families, based on a joint real estate project, was unshakable. However, someone grew impatient. As I walked out of my father's office one day, I received a text from Ivy, inviting me to her birthday party. Her arrogance amused me, but I still decided to attend. When Jonah saw me, he seemed momentarily startled, but quickly composed himself. Did he think I would act like those women who couldn't handle the man they loved being with someone else? That was something only a fool would do. Jonah never expected that I had come empty-handed and had in fact given him to Ivy as my gift. Jonah remained silent, his face darkening. He stared at me for a long time, the embarrassment in his eyes giving way to confusion and scrutiny. I didn't look away but met his gaze. After a while, he seemed to decide to compromise. Anastasia, take back what you said, he urged. I stayed unmoved. The veins on his forehead became visible, and his voice rose sharply. Take it back, or there will be consequences. The lively atmosphere around us went silent, and Ivy, clearly frightened, shrank back, too afraid to speak. My laugh echoed loudly in the still room. Looking at Ivy, who was clinging to Jonah as if trying to become one with him, I mocked. President Jonah, now that you have your beauty, I'm sure my gift is to your liking. As for the consequences, tell me, what could I, Anastasia, not afford? Jonah's pupils dilated for a moment. He gave me one last look, grabbed Ivy's hand and smirked. Anastasia, tomorrow I'll go to the Anastasia family to break off our engagement. You can avoid it now, but you'll have to admit your mistake later. Before he could say any more, I interrupted. Fine, I said, and Jonah froze. His smug smile still lingered, though anyone with sharp eyes could see he realized he had gone too far. I turned around and left without giving him another chance to speak. Behind me, a male voice called out, I really will go to break off the engagement. I paused for a moment, but as I felt no emotional reaction, I knew then that after 24 years of knowing Jonah and 7 years of being together, I had truly let him go. To celebrate, I planned to visit a quiet bar owned by a friend, but just as I entered the hotel lobby, I found myself caught up in an unexpected scene. A tall, lanky boy was standing in the corner, crouched down, his body hunched like a quail, eyes red from crying. In front of him stood a fierce-looking man demanding, Get out! It's no use begging me. If you've offended Mr. Chen, you're in for trouble. The boy, trembling, pleaded, Please, my grandmother is sick. She's waiting for me to earn money to save her life. The man was unmoved. Your family's problems are not my concern. Get out. The boy crouched down further, staring blankly at the floor. Seeing him in such a broken state, I felt an impulse, and my feet, which had been heading for the door, turned in the opposite direction. I walked toward him, and he didn't notice me approaching. I crouched beside him, bringing myself to his level. What's your name? How old are you? What's your background? Would you like to come work for me? I asked 4 questions in rapid succession. Finally, the boy looked up. His eyes were like obsidian, dark but bright. Leo, 22 years old, a senior at Juning University, he replied. The name sounded oddly familiar. Sister, can I really come work for you? He asked. I smiled. Sure, I need a bodyguard. Want the job? The salary's pretty good. I lied with a straight face. I had been trained in judo by my father since I was young and could easily take down 2 men, so I didn't actually need a bodyguard. But I had just joined the company and was still learning. It wouldn't be right to give Leo special treatment, so I created the position for him. He smiled shyly. Yes, sister, I'll be your bodyguard. Thank you for offering me this job. I'll protect you with my life. The tall, big boy smiled, his dimples faintly showing. Jonah had been very handsome, and I thought I had grown immune to good looks after more than 20 years of life. But when I looked at Leo's face, I was momentarily stunned. Jonah didn't show up to break off the engagement in the end, but I didn't care what he thought anymore. I told my father about Leo, and he tapped my nose, teasing, Aren't you afraid of helping someone with ulterior motives? Despite his teasing, my father hired a private detective to look into Leo. The detective was efficient, and the next night, my father handed me Leo's information. I looked it over and smiled. Everything Leo had said was true. The following day, after confirming Leo's identity, he officially started working for me. I paid him a month's salary up front, 20,000 yuan. He was an honest kid, though, and immediately returned half of it to me. I don't deserve this, he said. I stared at him seriously and transferred the money back. Take it. Otherwise, you won't be working here. He looked at me with brighter eyes, and after a while, he spoke up, his voice trembling. Thank you, Sister Anastasia. Leo took over many aspects of my daily life. He came to my house in the mornings to make breakfast and lunch, drove me to work, and helped me with various tasks. Over time, I realized he was very sharp. Sometimes, when I couldn't understand certain parts of the project proposals I was reading, he would explain them to me in simple terms. One day, after I finally understood, I jumped up from the sofa and hugged his head affectionately. I wish I had a brain like yours, I said. Leo blushed, pushing me away, his eyes darting around. In that moment, I suddenly realized what I had done. I had pushed his head into mine. My face turned bright red with embarrassment. I quickly cleared my throat and muttered, I still have things to do. Let's call it a day. I'm going to bed. But as I turned away, I couldn't help but slap my forehead. Anastasia, what on earth did you do? Even in my room, the warmth in my cheeks didn't fade. I was blushing uncontrollably. When there was a knock at the door, I called out, Come in. Leo was standing outside. I looked at him, trying to act as if nothing had happened earlier, and forced myself to suppress the embarrassment I felt. Why haven't you gone home yet? I asked. I'm just about to leave. I came to say goodbye, he replied. Noticing that I looked unwell, he asked carefully, What's wrong? I sniffed and answered, Nothing. After a short pause, I continued, Tomorrow is the weekend. Do you have any plans? Do you need to visit your grandmother at the hospital? He seemed a bit surprised and took a moment to respond. A few seconds later, he said, No, I don't need to. I visit her every night. Why do you ask? Do you have any plans for tomorrow? I nodded and replied, I want to go out for a walk. Leo took a step forward. I'll come with you, he said. For some reason, I saw a hint of hope in his expression. How could an employee be so eager? I couldn't help but laugh. Will you be available whenever I need you? I spent 20,000 yuan. Why do I feel like I've bought your 24/7 attention? He smiled, looking pleased. You should rest first. I'll come pick you up tomorrow morning. Just before he closed the door, he suddenly glanced at me, raising his eyebrows. Sweet dreams, Anastasia. I was momentarily stunned. Was he flirting with me? The next morning, while I was still asleep, Leo arrived at my house. Anastasia, wake up quickly. If we're late, we won't get a good spot, he urged. I yawned, feeling sleepy. What are we doing? I asked. Camping, he said. I've already prepared everything and packed it into the car. When you're ready, we can go. Camping? That sounded interesting. Suddenly, I found myself much more eager, and my routine of getting ready sped up. Once everything was packed, I sat in the passenger seat, watching Leo drive with ease. I couldn't resist tapping his arm. Good job. You've prepared well. It must be nice to have a boyfriend like you who handles everything when we go out, I said. He smiled and looked at me. The way he looked at me made my playful mood vanish entirely. Just then, my phone rang, breaking the tension. It was Jonah. I answered without much thought. What do you want? My voice was calm, emotionless, as though the person on the other end were a stranger. Did you do that thing online? Jonah's voice came with an accusatory tone. I was confused. What are you talking about? Anastasia, you're from a wealthy family. You've never struggled, and you've had everything handed to you. So why are you making life difficult for someone like Ivy? Do you know that people online are calling her a mistress? They're saying she was too bold, showing off in front of the real wife, and deserved the backlash. You should quickly issue a statement saying you know that Ivy and I are actually friends, and that when you saw us on her birthday, it was just a joke. It took me a moment to process. So it's for Ivy, I said, cutting him off. Jonah, are you doing this on purpose to make me upset? You want me to make a video to clear Ivy's name? Who does she think she is? Is it wrong for people to call her a mistress? If you haven't woken up yet, go back to bed. Stop trying to bite at people when your brain is low on blood. You're a person, not a dog. I was about to hang up when Leo, holding a toothpick with a piece of fruit, offered it to me. The car had already stopped. I stared at Leo without opening my mouth. He persistently kept trying to feed me. Just taste it, just once, he insisted. I had to decline. No thanks. This piece is too big for me. Suddenly, Jonah shouted from the phone, his voice sharp. Anastasia, why is there a man's voice in your bed? What are you doing? Leo's face turned bright red, and I quickly suppressed my embarrassment. "It's none of your business what I'm doing," I shouted at Jonah. With a snap, I ended the call. Leo pulled his hand back, and I felt uncomfortable. "Are we there?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. I jumped out of the car quickly, avoiding looking at Leo's face. I hurried to the trunk to grab the things I needed. Jonah sat on his bed, still holding his phone, completely stunned. He had been shouted at by Anastasia, and now he was processing the fact that she had hung up on him and was with another man. He shook his head vigorously. When they were together, even a simple kiss would make her blush. How could she be with someone else now? His head throbbed terribly. Last night, he had been out for business entertainment and had drunk a lot. Even though Ivy had tried to help him, he was not used to having a woman shield him. The drinks kept coming. 1, 2, 3, until the night ended late. He thought it would be unsafe for Ivy to go home alone, so he invited her to stay at his apartment. Unfortunately, the paparazzi were quick to snap pictures of them, and before long, rumors spread. The next morning, Jonah was awoken by the vibration of his phone. His Weibo feed was full of messages and comments, many of them tagging him. His WeChat also showed an overwhelming number of unread messages. When he opened them, he saw a mix of comments, mocking, blaming, congratulating, and others just enjoying the drama. His mother had called repeatedly, and when she couldn't reach him, she bombarded him with texts. "If you don't like Anastasia, be responsible and break off the engagement. How could I give birth to a son as shameless as you?" Jonah felt a headache coming on. He took a deep breath and tried to sort through everything that had happened. It became clear to him that the affair with Ivy had been exposed. A video showing everything that transpired on Ivy's birthday had gone viral, and the backlash against Ivy had intensified overnight. People were calling her a homewrecker and questioning her morals. Some comments even suggested locking up both her and Jonah. Jonah's head pounded harder with each comment. Was he angry that Ivy was being attacked, or was he upset about the comment, "She doesn't want you anymore"? As a young man, Jonah had envisioned growing old with Anastasia. Though he no longer loved her, he had imagined marrying her anyway, giving her the title of Mrs. Jonah. He hadn't expected that, a year after their engagement, it would be him who would want to leave. But what he had never anticipated was that Anastasia would leave him first. She had abandoned their 24-year relationship and no longer wanted him. When Jonah realized this, he felt a sharp pain, as though his heart had been squeezed. It only lasted for a moment, but it felt as if the pain was spreading throughout his entire body. He didn't know what was happening, but it made him incredibly uncomfortable. He longed to hear Anastasia's voice again, but what excuse could he use to contact her? After much searching in his mind, he decided to use Ivy's online bullying as a reason. But when Jonah called, what he actually wanted to say was that everything online was false. However, as soon as he spoke, it turned into an interrogation. He was questioning his fiancée over a secretary. The moment he said the words, Jonah regretted it, but his pride made it impossible to back down. The conversation ended embarrassingly. Jonah couldn't sit still anymore. The thought of the male voice on Anastasia's phone sent him into a panic. He quickly got out of bed, washed up, grabbed his car keys, and headed out. Just as he opened the door, Ivy appeared, rubbing her eyes. "Jonah, this address..." She started, but Jonah felt strange hearing those words at that moment. Still, he didn't recognize the issue. He nodded slightly, telling her, "Stay here for now. Don't go out or check your phone." After he closed the door, Jonah rushed out to find Anastasia. The roads were clear that Saturday morning, and Jonah sped toward the apartment she had bought. He rang the doorbell for a long time, but no one answered. He called Anastasia's parents, but they didn't know where she was either. After hanging up, Jonah stared at his phone, trying to think of what to do next. Jonah found himself lost and unsure of whom to reach out to in order to locate Anastasia. For the first time in his life, after 24 years, he truly experienced the discomfort of having something once secure spiral out of control. Was the little girl who had always been by his side since childhood truly going to leave him? Jonah waited in his car from morning to night, and as cigarette butts began to litter the ground, he finally spotted Anastasia. He wanted to rush to her, but when he saw her on tiptoe about to kiss another man, he froze in place. He remained there motionless, even as the two of them entered the apartment together. He stayed like a masochist, watching from below until 11 p.m. When Leo finally came out of the building, Jonah massaged his throbbing forehead and drove away. As Leo stepped out of the car, he was momentarily blinded by a gust of sand, squinting as if to rub his eyes. I quickly stopped him. "Don't rub them. Come here. Let me help." Leo lowered his hand, but because he was so tall, I couldn't reach his eyes. "Lower your head a bit," I instructed. He chuckled softly and bent down just enough for me to reach. I leaned in, gently blowing a few times on his eyes. Noticing how his eyes moved restlessly, I scolded him lightly. "Where are you looking? If you don't cooperate, I won't help you anymore." Leo shifted his gaze back. After a few more attempts, I asked, "How's that?" He nodded, confirming that his eyes were no longer watering. After returning from camping, my mood had significantly improved. Leo, having to juggle his thesis and graduation defense, had been running back and forth between my house, the hospital, and his school. In just a week, he had lost a noticeable amount of weight. "If you're tired, take a break," I offered. But he shook his head, handing me some freshly washed cherry tomatoes. "I don't feel tired at all when I'm with you." He gazed at me with his dark, bright eyes, making my face flush. "Don't you want some private space for yourself?" I asked, lowering my gaze, feeling embarrassed and avoiding his stare. However, Leo, who was usually so obedient, became a bit defiant. He reached out and gently lifted my chin. "I've been showing it so clearly. Can't you tell?" His eyes met mine, filled with fragmented yet intense affection. My heart raced, but I nervously looked away. "I'm suddenly a bit sleepy," I mumbled, yawning awkwardly. I quickly retreated to the bedroom, leaving Leo alone in the living room. Once in the bedroom, I touched my burning cheeks and scolded myself mentally. "Anastasia, you're doomed. You've fallen for him." The next day, I found myself both eager and nervous about seeing Leo. After waiting for a long time, he still hadn't shown up. I checked my phone, but there were no missed calls or messages. Leo was always punctual. After thinking for a moment, I dialed his number. No one picked up. I tried again. This time the call connected, but there was only static on the line. A bad feeling crept into my chest. "Leo," I shouted. But then a voice on the other end spoke, making my heart drop. "Ah, the famous Miss Anastasia is fond of this handsome boy, huh? Here's the deal. 1 million yuan, cash on delivery at the suburban warehouse. If you call the police, I'll kill him." My voice trembled as I quickly responded, "Don't do anything to him. I'll bring the money." The man on the other end laughed cruelly. I grabbed my bank card and sped toward the western suburbs, not forgetting to send a message to my parents to call the police immediately. When I arrived, I found Leo lying motionless on the ground, blood covering his face. "Leo! Leo! Wake up, please!" I cried, but he didn't respond. Anger surged inside me. "What have you done to him? Didn't I tell you not to hurt him?" I threatened. "Since you didn't listen, don't think you'll get away with it easily." Fury took over, and I became completely irrational. With a burst of strength, I attacked, knocking down the few men who were there. After a few rounds, all of them were on the ground, groaning in pain. One of them, clutching his bleeding head, mumbled, "I'm going to the police. I'll sue you for excessive defense, for intentional injury." Just as he finished speaking, the sound of police sirens filled the air. I kicked the unconscious kidnappers one last time, then helped Leo up. Once the kidnappers and Leo were sent to the hospital for treatment, I was taken to the police station. After I finished giving my statement, I walked out of the station and was immediately enveloped in a tight hug. "Anastasia, I'm so glad you're okay," Jonah said. I frowned at the tightness of his embrace. "You're hurting me," I replied. He loosened his grip but still held me firmly. Seizing the opportunity, I broke free. "Were you following me?" I asked coldly. "No. Zhao called me and told me you were in the police station for assaulting people," he said, his voice full of concern. "Worried about what?" I shot back. "Worried that if something happened to me, it would be harder for you to break off the engagement? Since you're in such a hurry, let's go to my house and settle it now," I said, adding, "I've already spoken to my parents, and they agreed." Jonah didn't respond but just stared at me, looking blank. "Do you really want to break off the engagement?" he asked. "Yes. Besides, weren't you the one who always brought up ending it before? I'm just fulfilling your wish. You should be happy." Jonah avoided addressing the mistakes he had made and shifted the conversation. Is it because of that pretty boy, Leo? I turned away, not wanting to engage with him, which he took as confirmation. He looked like someone betrayed, almost breaking down. Anastasia, we've known each other for 24 years and been together for 7. Are you really going to throw all that away? I rolled my eyes, too exhausted to argue. It felt like talking to a brick wall. Whatever you say, I muttered. Just then a taxi passed by, and I quickly hopped into the back. To the hospital, please. Hurry, I said. A month later, Leo's concussion had healed, and the joint project between the Lin and Han families was nearing its final stages. During this time, Jonah, who had been insisting on breaking off the engagement, never took any action. But if he wouldn't, I would. I took my parents and the engagement tokens and headed to the Han family house while Jonah was away. After my parents appealed to both emotion and reason, Jonah's parents sighed and agreed to the breakup. Uncle Han looked at me with sympathy. We know Jonah has done a lot of foolish things these past 6 months, but he has changed. I promise he won't act so carelessly again. You two have been together for 24 years. Are you sure you can't give him another chance? I shook my head. Uncle, I can't overlook his flaws. Besides, I already have someone I like, and I don't want to make him feel wronged. The kidnapping incident made me realize how important Leo had become to me. When he was in the ambulance with blood on his face, clutching my hand tightly, he had asked, "You fought for me, so you must have feelings for me, right? Anastasia, I like you. After I'm out of the hospital, will you be my girlfriend?" I agreed, and now I was no longer Jonah's fiancée, but Leo's girlfriend. When Jonah learned that the engagement was officially over, he stood outside my house in the pouring rain. I didn't want to deal with it, so I simply removed Ivy from the blacklist. An hour later, she arrived by taxi, dragging the fainted Jonah back to his home. Leo's voice came through the phone asking, "Anastasia, is Jonah still bothering you?" I looked at him, and though his eyes were fixed on the computer, he was clearly still aware of my situation. "I asked Ivy to take him away," I replied. "Why are you video calling me? Didn't you say you didn't want distractions while writing your thesis?" I teased him. The typing on the other end stopped, and he looked around before moving closer to the phone, his handsome face filling the screen. "I miss you," he said. I stared into his eyes, my heart beating quickly. Sincerity, I thought to myself, truly is a powerful weapon. On the day Leo finished his thesis defense, he proposed to me all at once. I happily agreed, and we went straight home. Initially, my father wasn't fond of Leo, but after a meal and some time spent with him over tea in the study, he had changed his mind. When we left the house, my parents now referred to him as Leo, no longer Mr. Yang. On the day we went to get our marriage certificate, just as we arrived at the Civil Affairs Bureau, I received a message from a colleague with a link. "Is this true?" it asked. I clicked on it and found that Ivy was causing trouble again. The image showed her with a diamond ring on her left hand, and on closer inspection, it matched the one on Jonah's hand. Was Jonah proposing to her? I looked at the screen, my face expressionless. As I was about to close it, I accidentally swiped to the comment section below. To my astonishment, the comments implied that I was the mistress in the relationship between Ivy and Jonah. They even suggested that the reason Ivy was criticized online was that I was bullying her with my power. I simply replied to my colleague, "False." In my mind, I knew these comments were likely bought by paid posters. "How are you going to fight back?" my colleague asked. Without hesitation, I took out my phone, rotated Leo's face towards me, and took 8 intimate photos. Then I snapped one of the Civil Affairs Bureau. I combined them into a 9-square grid and posted it on Weibo. "Thanks for your attention. I'm just about to get my marriage certificate with my boyfriend. Feel free to send us your blessings." At 8 p.m. tonight, I'll randomly select 20 lucky fans from the comment section to receive a 10,000 Wen red envelope. Thanks to the support of money, my Weibo post quickly rose to the hot search list. Ivy's rumor about me being jealous and slandering her backfired. As the paid posters disappeared, the comments that the public truly wanted to make appeared. Ivy, once again, faced a backlash, forcing her to close the comment section and hide in shame. When I got home, I found Jonah sitting outside my house, his eyes bloodshot and clearly sleep-deprived. Upon seeing me, he staggered to his feet and rushed toward me. "Anastasia, did you really get the marriage certificate? Are you lying to me?" I held up 2 brand-new red certificates. "There's no point in lying to you. I'm Mrs. Leo now." Jonah stared at the certificates for a long time, his lips moving, but no words coming out. As I opened the door to enter the house, his desperate voice rang out from behind. Anastasia, I admit that I was wrong before, but do you really think this Leo is a good person? I've checked. He doesn't have a seriously ill grandmother. He just wants to cheat you out of your money. I looked at Leo, confused. He looked back at me seriously. I can explain. Jonah, still unable to accept the situation, continued. Anastasia, he cheated on you, but you don't blame him. What about me? I made such a small mistake, and you've never forgiven me for it. It's not fair. I love you. I really do. We've been together for so long, and I forgot how that feeling felt. Can't you give me another chance? I was exhausted and didn't feel like talking anymore. Jonah, you say you love me, but Ivy has provoked me so many times, and each time you handled it gently. I used to like you, I said, but I'm not stupid. I always knew, maybe you loved me, but most of it was probably just about not wanting to lose me. You didn't want me to be a stronger person after we broke up, and you didn't want me to move on. Jonah stared at me as if he had no more arguments. Anastasia, I didn't know about those things online. I've already fired Ivy. No one in our industry will hire her again. If you think this punishment isn't enough, I can... Before he could continue, Leo interrupted him. Jonah, when Anastasia cared about you, you were the boss. Now that she doesn't care about you, who do you think you are? I'm glad you made that small mistake, because that's how I became Anastasia's husband. Jonah's breathing became labored, as if the words were crushing him. He looked at me one last time before running off, overwhelmed with emotion. After that day, I never saw him again. Leo took my hand and said, Anastasia, I'll take you somewhere. We arrived at a detached villa, and I stared at it in disbelief, my mouth hanging open. Leo led me inside and, unexpectedly, dropped to his knees. I'm sorry, Anastasia. Actually, I lied to you. I'm not a poor student. I'm Leo, the head of Juning Enterprises. My head spun as I realized why his name had sounded familiar. If he was the head of Juning Enterprises, even my father would have to show him respect. Did my parents know your true identity? I asked. Yes, Leo replied. On the day you took me home, I told your father the truth. I looked at him, still processing the revelation. The anger at being deceived surged again. Jonah, was it fun to deceive me? When you took that 20,000 yen from me, you must have thought I was naive, didn't you? Leo panicked, trying to explain. No, that wasn't my intention. I didn't want to deceive you, but at the time you liked Jonah so much, and I didn't have the confidence to compete with him. Anastasia, you're the only pure place in my heart. How could I hurt you? He quickly stood up and ran to another room. Wait for me, I have something to show you. He returned holding an old notebook, which he handed to me. Anastasia, maybe you don't know, but I've liked you for a long time. The notebook contained just a few entries, mentioning key people in Leo's life. His mother, his stepfather, and a little girl. The entries described a disturbing event. Yesterday, when my mother was out, he came into my room while I was asleep. He touched me in disgusting ways. I kicked him hard in the crotch and almost disabled him. I hated myself for being so weak. When my mother came back, she didn't believe me. She beat me and threw me out of the house. Reading those words, my heart broke for Leo, realizing the depth of his suffering and everything he had kept hidden. For 2 days, I was so hungry that I searched through the trash. I was starving when I passed by a primary school, and a little girl, seeing my plight, offered me her leftover sandwich. The boy next to her warned, "Be careful, he might have a disease." I quickly responded, "I don't have any disease." Her name was Anastasia. What a lovely name. Was that little girl really me? But I couldn't recall anything about it. I continued reading, learning that I had enrolled in the same high school she went to. I simply wanted to observe her from a distance. It seemed she was close to the boys she had grown up with, and though it made me sad, I knew I had no right to yearn for something that wasn't mine. As long as she was happy, that was enough. The beast died, and my mother followed him in death. It seemed she had forgotten she was a mother. I should have been grieving, but after arranging their funerals, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. During my sophomore year in high school, my biological father unexpectedly found me. It turned out I was the illegitimate son of a wealthy family. His legitimate son had died in an accident, and so he took me in. I was busy with a lot of work, trying to become a worthy heir to the family fortune. There was so much to learn every day, and whenever I felt overwhelmed by the pressure, I enjoyed walking around her university just to clear my mind. The man didn't seem to care for her as much anymore. On the night of her wedding, I parked my car near her house. I wanted to witness the moment when she found happiness. But by midnight, I saw her running toward the garage, tears streaming down her face. She sped off toward the riverside, and I almost couldn't hold myself back. Fortunately, she just leaned against her car, watching the ebb and flow of the tide throughout the night. When she gave Jonah a gift at the birthday party, an uncontrollable thought stirred in me. My chance had finally come. Grandma Lee's health was rapidly declining, and she had no family left. She was the one who had saved me from starving to death, taking care of me when no one else would. I wanted to help her. Damn it, those kidnappers. They dared to take me. They beat me badly, but when the phone call connected, I knew my girl would come to rescue me, like a goddess descending from the clouds. I lied to her, hoping she would go easy on me when she found out the truth.